Welcome to the Wellness Collective. We are excited that our featured guest expert is Dr. Stacey Jackson-Lampley. Dr. Jackson-Lampley is the Chief Psychologist and Director of Clinical Services at Howard University's Counseling Service. She also has a faculty appointment in Howard University School of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Jackson-Lampley will present Healthy Relationships, Reflections to Consider During the Pandemic. Welcome, Dr. Jackson-Lampley. We're so excited to have you with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Dean Richardson. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you. I'm really excited, and it's always a pleasure to be talking with the Howard University community. So, as you said, I'll be talking a little bit about relationships today. And this whole period of the pandemic has given a lot of us an opportunity to really reflect on the nature of our relationships. And before I move into that, I just want to take a moment in honor of Black History Month, which just ended. But I want to take a moment and just acknowledge the capacity for relationships and the relationship-oriented nature of the Black community, of the African American community, and how our need for relationships and our capacity to seek relationships and sustain relationships has been such a bedrock of our community. Just briefly, if we think about the notion of fictive kin, which probably came about even before slavery, but certainly during slavery, that was one of the things that really kept the Black community together in spite of the trauma of slavery. And fictive kin is when often parents were sold from one plantation to another, and other members of the one plantation would take in the children of those parents that were sold and continue to provide them with the nurturance that they needed. And also not just children, but extended family networks developed. And this was fictive kin. And, certainly in our history, we're accustomed to calling people that are not actually related to us by blood, but calling them aunt or uncle or play cousin. So the notion of fictive kin, which, like I said, probably, as from my understanding, came about even before slavery in African communities, but certainly during slavery, is something that the need for relationships and the ability and the capacity for the Black community to sustain relationships, that was so present. And of course, that's continued to this day. Certainly in many communities, people that are not blood related have strong relationship networks. And I want to say that's not just with the Black community. One of my colleagues who is Jewish taught, and all of her family members, other than a few, were lost during the Holocaust, killed during the Holocaust. But she grew up with aunts and uncles that were not blood related, but because they had a need to seek community, even though the blood relatives were no longer living. So the notion of fictive kin just speaks to our need as a community and also as humans to form relationships. And one other thing, just again, in honor of Black History Month, I want to talk about the role that spirituals had in the Black community and how that was another example of our need for relationships and the way that we kept relationships going, even in spite of the trauma of slavery. There weren't a lot of things that slaves could do freely, but singing was often one of the things that they could do freely, and they could lament through spirituals. They could also plan through the use of spirituals. We were taught that some of the spirituals had double meanings, and the slaves could plan their escape through the use of spirituals with double meanings, such as, steal away. And also, my understanding is that Harriet Tubman used one of the spirituals, I believe, Go Down Moses, to let slaves know that she was coming to help lead them to freedom. And so, again, this speaks to the importance of relationships and the strong capacity of the Black community to sustain themselves through relationships, like I said, via fictive kin, through the use of spirituals. So I just wanted to acknowledge and honor that as we move out of Black History Month. And I will say, even working at Howard, the importance of relationships is really exemplified, I think, at Howard. So many students, when they matriculate through Howard, they find faculty and staff mentors that take them in almost like family. And I know even in my department in the University Counseling Service, we have a saying, once you're part of the HUCS family, you're always a part of the HUCS family. And we have trainees, and I'm a former trainee, that have left and come back and visit. And so the strong relationship-oriented network of Howard is what keeps so many people at Howard. So I just want to honor that. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the effects of the pandemic, because that's given many of us an opportunity to reflect on our own relationships and how we engage in relationships or how we don't engage in relationships. So during the pandemic, I know people have noticed many things. Some have felt isolated, and of course, that's not uncommon because of stay-at-home orders, because of the need to social distance, working remotely. Many people have felt isolated and have really struggled with that during the pandemic. The need for physical touch is something that is a part of our humanity, and many people have really struggled with not being able to have physical touch in their lives, especially if they live alone. And so the isolation, even Zoom is wonderful, but it's not everything. And so many people have struggled with needing more relationships during the pandemic because they felt so isolated, and feeling the loss of the important relationships in their lives because they're not able to be in person. Another effect is some people have discovered during the pandemic that they're more alone than they realized because they haven't taken, because of the demands of life, there just hasn't been the time, and they realize that they haven't given as much effort into cultivating relationships that they want, in addition to those that are just the necessary relationships, such as work relationships. Or parents have found that they're so engaged with their children and family life that they have lost contact with friends. And they recognize that during this pandemic, when they're spending so much time at home as their children are doing virtual school, and they're recognizing also that they haven't cultivated other relationships. And like I said, people that are working from home, they're realizing that they haven't really, they've been so busy with life and work that the other relationships that can nurture their whole selves have been missing. And something else that people have noticed, which some have been ashamed to admit, but it is a reality for many, is that some have realized that their anxiety or their discomfort has been such that they're actually grateful for the inability to be with others during the pandemic. And again, that's something that some people are ashamed to admit because so many are talking about isolation and wanting to be with others and missing others. But it's important, I think, to recognize that some people struggle so much with social anxiety or insecurity that actually being alone has been comfortable, even though they're ashamed to admit that. And they also recognize that maybe there's some things that they need to work on in themselves so that they can be more comfortable in relationships. So all kinds of things have come up for people during the pandemic. And I really want to encourage all of you out there to be honest with yourself and accept where you are without judgment and with compassion for yourself. This time, has given all of us an opportunity to reflect and learn some things about ourselves, some of which we may be happy to learn and some which might trouble us. And so in the area of relationships, I just encourage you to, again, reflect with compassion, because this is an opportunity to learn more about yourself. And it's also an opportunity to kind of identify where you want to make some changes in your life. Okay. So when you think about yourself as a relational being, one of the first steps is to go back a little bit before you think about yourself in other relationships. It's important to kind of get acquainted with yourself. That relationship that you have with yourself is actually truly, and I know it sounds like a cliche, but it's really true. It is one of the most important relationships. And it really does form one of the bases of all the other relationships that you're able to have in your life. So get acquainted with yourself, get to know yourself. So often I talk with people who are in relationships, and these romantic relationships, these are friendships, even very involved in their family relationships. And when I ask, well, what are the things that you like to do? What are the things that you value? And sometimes they're really taken aback because they've been so engaged in pleasing those around them, or making an effort to not displease those around them, that they've lost themselves and they've forgotten, what they actually like, what they dislike, what their values are. And actually, they've even lost touch with what they want in relationships because they've been so focused on pleasing the people that they're in relationships with. So first, take a step back. So just kind of a very brief imagery exercise. And for those of you out there, if you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please do that. Or if not, that's fine. Just kind of go inward. And I like for you to just kind of think about yourself. About who you are, what you like, what you dislike, what you value. And then now try to ask yourself, what are the positive aspects of my character that help truly define who I really am across most situations and with most people? Again, what are the positive aspects of my character that help truly define who I really am across most situations and with most people? What are those core aspects of you that are almost unshakable? Okay, is it that you're a loyal person? Are you a caring person? Are you a dependable person? What are those things that you know about yourself and that are almost unshakable no matter who you deal with? Okay. Now, ask yourself, what sometimes blocks those positive aspects of my character from really, really being present? Or in other words, what really keeps my light from shining? What keeps me from really, really being me in relationships? Is it fear of rejection? Is it the fear that I won't be good enough if I do my best? Is it because I get involved in relationships with people who really don't appreciate my light? Is it anger, sadness, insecurity, envy? And the goal, like I said, is to think about what keeps you sometimes from being who you really want to be in relationships? What keeps your life light from shining? Okay, so I ask you to do these things, and you can open your eyes if you have them closed, or, sort of come back out if you were going in. And I ask you to think about these things for several reasons. Um, it can be helpful to do a self assessment inventory, and this is for all of us to do periodic, what I call self checks, to stay true to yourself and to help determine when you need to make changes. Um, so that means like thinking about yourself, what you like, what you dislike, um, how you are, and are you being true to yourself in the relationships that you're engaged in? And if you aren't, then it's time to maybe think about why is that? Okay. And another reason that to sometimes do a self check is because it can prevent burnout. When you are engaged in relationships that are depleting and that don't allow you to truly be yourself, it really does cause burnout, because you're not able to truly let your light shine when you're in relationships, and that's depleting. So it's important to periodically think about how you're feeling and how you are expressing yourself, and are you being allowed to express yourself in relationships? If not, it can cause burnout. Okay, so after you've thought about yourself and how you are in relationships, and what you contribute, your core qualities that you think can contribute to any relationship you're in, as well as those things that might sometimes get in the way of you really being yourself and expressing yourself in relationships. After you've done that, it can be helpful to think about how you came to be who you are. Think about your family background, or however you grew up, in whatever kind of situation you grew up in, whether it was with family, blood family, or um, um, adopted family. But think about your background, where you grew up, how things were expressed in your family, what was valued. All of those things contribute to how you engage in relationships and what you expect in relationships. And I do want to say, for students, for Howard students, one of the things that can be really challenging when students come to college is, especially in roommate situations, backgrounds are different. And so if you came from a family where, everything was pretty quiet, people talked in hushed tones, there was no raising voices, it can be very disorienting to have a roommate who came from a family where things were loud and boisterous, and voices were sometimes raised, and, you know, everybody was just sort of okay with that. The way that you learn to communicate and what you grew up with can certainly contribute to uh, difficulties that you might have in friendships, and especially in roommate relationships. And so often I talk with students about, when they're having difficulties with roommates, think about kind of how you grew up and how you express yourself and how you learn to communicate, and what was acceptable communication in your household, and is that contributing maybe to some of the difficulties that you're having there. And how you grew up is fine, but just recognize the person that you're with may have grown up in a different way and learn to communicate in a different way. So it's important to understand that your communication style, and to communicate what you need in a way that your roommate can hear you, and to not be judgmental, but to kind of work to understand each other. Okay. Uh, Moving on. Another thing about relationships, after you've thought about yourself, thought about what contributes to the kinds of relationships that you have, and to your communication style and your expectations in relationships. Something that's really important to consider is boundaries, and thinking about how you define boundaries in your relationships. Not doing so can cause a lot of pain, can cause a lot of miscommunication, and a lot of hurt feelings. So really think about your own boundaries. It's important to have some idea about what are the deal breakers for you. Is it lying, or is it being lied to? Is it someone not being polite? Is it betrayal? But what are your deal breakers? And it's important to understand what they are so that you know how to communicate that to those that you're in relationships with. You know how to communicate your expectations. And it is important to be able to convey your boundaries and your limits to others in a manner that is relatively comfortable for you. So you may not be the most assertive person, and that's fine. We all have different personalities, but there is a way that you can convey your boundaries. And again, conveying boundaries, setting limits, and setting boundaries in relationships, sometimes it's just slightly outside of your comfort zone. But find a way to communicate your boundaries in a way that's comfortable for you. Now, I'll talk just very briefly a little bit about effective communication. So, researchers have identified some of the difficulties that appear in conflict situations, in conflictual relationships, in other words. So, some of the key things that researchers have found that contribute to difficulties in relationships are avoidance of conflict and then delayed responses. So, people being in relationships and then not wanting to have conflict, avoiding conflict, even though things are really bothering you. And the response that you're having, your anger or your disappointment, gets delayed and delayed and delayed until it comes out in a way that is harmful to the relationship. So avoiding conflict can actually be detrimental to a relationship because it leads to delayed responses. So all relationships have conflict. And it's important not to avoid the conflict, but to be honest about it, but to find a way to communicate effectively. So avoidance of conflict. Another difficulty that researchers have found that contributes to conflictual relationships is blaming. And that going beyond the behavior of the person that you're in a relationship with to their character. So, for example, instead of saying, you're mean, that's more about the character, saying, when you raise your voice at me, I don't like it. It makes me feel defensive or hurts my feelings. So instead of going to the character, discuss the behavior. And that can actually lead to less conflict. And then another thing that researchers have found that contributes to difficulties in relationships is having a win-lose mentality. Like you have to win this argument, you have to win things, you have to win disagreements in your relationships. Instead of look at goals and outcomes. It's not about winning and losing. It's about what do we want to achieve and accomplish together in this relationship? What are the difficulties and how can we work toward things being better? As opposed to, I have to have my way, and if not, that's it. That's a win-lose mentality. Instead, look at goals and outcomes. So the kind of climate that you develop in your relationship or that you cultivate can really help. Avoid a defensive climate. Researchers have found that a defensive climate, of course, leads to more difficulties in relationship. And a defensive climate can be one that's judgmental, critical, one that's marked by rigidity, having a hidden agenda. So that leads, all of those things lead to a defensive climate and of course lead to difficulties in relationships. Instead, try for a supportive climate. Have a problem orientation and focus on the task at hand. If it's trying to, for example, decide where to go for vacation, and that's just like an example, focus on the task at hand. It's not what I want. That has to be where we go, as opposed to what you want. But let's think about, what do we want in this vacation? And how can we have a vacation that meets both our needs, for example? And again, that's just a very simple example, but focus on the task at hand as opposed to having a defensive climate, win-lose mentality, being rigid, etc. And then also something that cultivates a supportive climate in a relationship is empathy. Try to understand the other person. Try to understand where they're coming from. And also flexibility. And last thing I just want to say, I have a few tips for relationships that I think can be really helpful. When you're in a relationship and you're trying to communicate, focus on what you want to convey versus what you want to say. A lot of people struggle with what should I say? How can I say this? Think more about what you want to convey to the other person. And then you can figure out what you want to say. But if you think about what you want to convey, that truly helps move the relationship along, and it makes it easier to communicate. And another tip is, when you're in a relationship, think about, who do I want to be in this relationship? Regardless of what the other person is doing, who do I want to be in this situation? And that can take you a long way, because again, the relationship that you have with yourself is one of the most important relationships and forms the basis of so many others. And if you think about who you want to be in the situation, who you want to be in the relationship, that can help you think about how to communicate with the other person, how to respond during conflict. Think about who you want to be. Okay. Well, I think I'm almost out of time. And so now I will go back to you, Dean Richardson, again. That was just very brief talk about relationships, but thank you so much for the opportunity.
Very powerful, Dr. Jackson-Lampley. We're so excited about what you presented, and we're really looking forward to your next contribution to the Wellness Collective. Your ability to share so much in such a little time is just so powerful. Thank you so much. And I hope that members of our community take advantage of the tremendous resources of our University Counseling Center. It's just a wealth of knowledge and information and expertise available to our community. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean Richardson.